Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Millyard Museum. Thank you all for coming out here on this beautiful Saturday morning. My name is Jeff Barraclough. I am the Executive Director for the Manchester Historic Association, which operates the Millyard Museum here. I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about some upcoming events that we have before we start the program. But the Manchester Historic Association is a member-supported organization. I know there are many members of ours in the audience here, so thank you all for your support. If you are not a member and are interested in learning more, we do have some information out at the front desk about membership opportunities as well as some upcoming programs. Just to give you a preview of some of these, first of all, happening today, right now and after this program, is the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance's Old House and Barn Expo, and that is being put on by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. The Manchester Historic Association is an organizational partner of this event with them, and it's being held at St. Anselm College. So if you're interested in learning more about how to support and renovate, conserve your properties, your old homes, barns, feel free to go over there after this. It is open today until 5:30, and then all day tomorrow from 9:30 till 4:30. Today at 1:30, in conjunction with that, there is going to be a tour of the Abbey Church at St. Anselm College. So if you're interested in doing more history after this, you head over to St. Anselm College, and that should be a great tour and information about that building. Other events coming up here on Saturday, April 13th, we're going to have a book signing and a talk. The author is Avery Kelly Clark, and her new book, Malice Aforethought, is all about the Pembroke, New Hampshire murder that took place in the 19th century. It's the first novelization of that event, and so that will be held here on April 13th. And then on April 17th, which is a Wednesday evening, is our annual meeting. And in conjunction with our annual meeting, we'll be having an exhibit opening of our newest exhibition, which is going to be called Who Wore It? The Forensics of a Dress. And we'll be debuting 20 historic dresses from our collection that spanned about 200 years, from the late 1700s up to the 1980s. And we'll be showing those dresses, but also the stories of the lives of the women who wore them, and looking specifically at what you can learn about the history of a dress by looking at it. And then finally, on May 21st, it is our Historic Preservation Awards, which is our big event that will be held at St. Anselm College, where we will be honoring 6 individuals and organizations that have helped conserve and preserve Manchester's history in the last year. Before I introduce our speaker, I just do want to acknowledge the board members of the Historic Association who are here today. Jeff Murdoch, our vice president, and Amanda Quinlan, one of our board members. So thank you both for being here, and thank you all to our volunteers and our members. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Inez McDermott. Inez is the professor emerita of art history at New England College, and she was the curator of an exhibit that was at the Museum of the White Mountains at Plymouth State University last year, called An Enduring Presence, The Old Man of the Mountain. And the display you see behind her is sort of the permanent piece of that has been traveling around the state since that exhibition closed, that shows some of the items that were on display, talking about the legacy of the Old Man of the Mountain. And we had a small role to play in working with Inez in loaning some of few of our objects in our collection to that exhibition. So it's my pleasure to have Inez here with us today, and thank you so much for coming. Welcome.
Thanks. So thank you. Is this, can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Okay. Great. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. It's such a gorgeous day. I'm really impressed that people came out to hear a talk on the old man as opposed to being outside. And I also want to say, Jeff, the museum had a small role to play, but you had a large role to play because you referred me to a number of other organizations that had old man paraphernalia, including the New Hampshire potato chip company from Salem. Yeah. So that was a real find. So thank you very much, and the Boy Scouts too, which was terrific. I just want to thank New Hampshire Humanities. This talk is part of New Hampshire Humanities to Go program, which is a program that brings talks like these to historical societies and libraries and museums and other not-for-profit organizations around the state. And it's because of their generous funding that they're able to organize a number of really fantastic lectures on various topics. So if you have a little bit of extra money, and of course you want to give money to the Manchester Millyard Museum and the Historic Association, but if you've got a little extra, New Hampshire Humanities is a great place to see your money go and really elevate the importance of humanities and our history and literature and really important ideas that, that we should be talking about in New Hampshire. So as Jeff said, I was the curator of the exhibition at the Museum of the White Mountains this summer. But before that, I had been the curator of a very small exhibition that was up at the site of the Old Man Viewing Center. I don't know how many of you may have seen that. It opened in 1996, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I have a long history with the Old Man. As I'm sure many of you do as well. How many of you had seen the Old Man of the Mountain before it fell? Okay, so most of you have seen it. Okay, most of my audiences had seen it. I did talk to a high school group, and they were really cute about not quite getting it, what we were talking about, but saying that their parents and grandparents had some of them framed photographs of the Old Man in their homes, and they always wondered what that was all about. So I was glad we could talk about that. What I want to talk about in terms of, oh, this is not working. You know what, I think, I'm sorry about this. I think I just need to kind of reboot. It worked.
Sometimes it will freeze.
Yeah. Let me try it again. You don't want to look at the same image the whole time. I wondered, it's the Logitech, Jeff, so I'm wondering if that's...
Sometimes I've had to go out of...
Okay, you want to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. One of the questions that came up when we were curating the, organizing our show was, of course, we were going to tell the story of the Old Man and the role that he played in New Hampshire history. But one of the questions that kept coming up was why? Why is the Old Man? How did the Old Man become such a symbol of New Hampshire? And I called the Old Man he, and I think most people do that. Obviously, we say it's an old man. Are there personality traits or characteristics of this, frankly, pile of rocks that somehow have connected the public imagination to an idea of a New Hampshire personality or a type? And so that's one of the questions I'd like for us to kind of think about as I'm presenting this history. For those of you, those few of you who have never saw the Old Man, it sits kind of in the middle, sort of to the north end of Franconia Notch State Park, which is about 6,000 acres, that runs through from about Woodstock, Lincoln, New Hampshire, up to Franconia. If you drive up 93, you end up going up the Franconia Notch Parkway, and then 93 kind of widens again. And through the parkway is really where the state park is. And those of you who may remember looking up over your shoulder as you're driving north and seeing the Old Man, and you could only see him for a few seconds because there were really only a few dozen yards where he came into view in this perfect profile. I also want to say this photograph was taken on April 26th, 2003, a few days before the Old Man fell. And it's a wonderful photograph that has been published on Wikipedia, and the man who took it gave permission for anyone who wanted to use it, which is really great, because one of the other things you may remember about the Old Man is that oftentimes he was covered in fog and clouds, and so he happened upon this gorgeous day to take this photograph. So it's wonderful that we have that, one of the last images probably. spoiler alert, if you haven't already gathered, the old man is no longer there. The morning of May 3rd, 2003, some park employees looked up and noticed that the old man was gone. And the photograph I'm showing on the right shows the way it looked that morning, that was taken that morning. Again, a nice, bright, clear day. The night before had been a very foggy evening, and the old man was hidden from view. The man I'm showing you, that photograph was taken May 3rd as well, and that man is Dick Hamilton. Dick Hamilton was the president of White Mountain Attractions, and some of you are nodding in recognition. Really a wonderful ambassador for the North Country and a real connector. White Mountain Attractions is a tourist organization. In fact, you can still go there. It's in Lincoln. You pull off from the highway, and you can get all kinds of pamphlets for all kinds of tourist attractions, and the staff there can help you plan your visit to the North Country. But Dick did more than that. He was involved in all kinds of lobbying for legislation that had to do with the North Country, probably knew all the merchants in the North Country, and was very interested in the historic and cultural history of the area as well. So one of the first people that the park employees called was Dick. Every night when Dick would drive home from his from work in Lincoln, he lived in Littleton, he said he'd turn over his shoulder and say, "Good night, boss," to the old man. And he said that Friday night, he looked, he couldn't see the old man, and he said, "I said, good night, boss, wherever you are." And so this obviously was devastating to Dick and to many other people too, which is another question. Why was this so devastating? I've handed out a list of facts and figures about the old man. You can see that it is, I've told you how many tons it is, and it consists of 5 ledges of Conway granite and so many, I think 15 or 1,700 feet from Profile Lake that sits at its bottom. But what is it about this geological wonder that made it seem as though, as many people have said, like a member of the family was gone, as someone really important? They remember where they were, what they were doing when they heard the old man had fallen, in the same way that we hear about a disaster, an assassination, a terrible event that's happened. So let me ask you, does anyone want to share a favorite memory of seeing the old man of the mountain, or their experience of hearing that the old man had fallen? Yes.
When I started moving into New Hampshire, coming to New Hampshire about 20 years ago, I wanted to see that because it's on everything.
Mm-hmm.
And you're driving, and the highway goes from 90 feet, reduces itself.
To a parkway.
And
Yeah.
traffic was going slow, because it's always slow, especially summertime. But you were right about, you just miss it. You really have to look. And I think going north is the best way to see it. Going south, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had to turn around and try to go slower.
Mm-hmm.
But the exits were close by.
Right, you could get off and walk down
Yeah.
and stand at the bottom of
There's
Profile Lake.
There was a place there, Echo Lake or something?
There's Profile Lake and Echo Lake. If you look, I have a better map, but between Profile Lake, if you look up, the old man is right there, and a little bit north is Echo Lake. Yes.
I think I was there when it fell. I'm not sure. I don't know what time it fell in the morning, but I was at Echo Lake, and I heard a tremendous crash.
Oh, really?
And I went over. Other people were going over that way,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if you could see it or not. And I don't know if it was foggy or not, but I heard the noise, and a lot of people were there. It was May 3rd.
There was, so they think it fell either the night of May 2nd or early morning May 3rd. And it was 8 a.m. that they discovered that it had fallen. And some campers in the area said they had heard something. There also, I talk about this later, but I can tell you now. There were no meteorological events, no geological events, so there was no seismic activity, there were no high winds, there was nothing that would have caused any alarm to think that the old man might be in danger. It seemed that the fog the night before had cleared, and at some point that night it had fallen, which I'll talk a little bit about what geologists say.
I first saw that in the 1960s when I was a young man and my parents took a ride through. We always took a ride up Franconia Notch and down Crawford Notch. Probably do that 3 or 4 times a year. I think the ride up there was better when it was Route 3 before they made it a parkway. It was much more homey, or you could get closer to things. We used to get out at Boise Rock or go to the basin. So I know why they improved it, but I just thought it was better the other way. But I do remember, you know, seeing that for the first time. Plus, reading the Daniel Webster quote, which always struck me as just so fascinating, and that was in the 1850s.
Yeah, and I'll talk about that. He's talking about a quote attributed to Daniel Webster about the old man and about New Hampshire. It really connects the two. Yeah, and I'll also talk about the building of the Franconia Parkway, where the old man played a central role in the 40 years of debating whether that parkway should be built or not. So the old man is really tied to a lot of New Hampshire history. So we'll have some time at the end too to talk more about all of this. As some of you mentioned, you know, you knew about the old man because it was on everything, right? So what I'm showing you here is just kind of a collage of both, here's our state emblem from 1945. The old man was made part of our state emblem at the same time as Live Free or Die. Obviously our state quarter. Postage stamps, the 3-cent stamp was from 1955. Our state highway signs. I've had friends from out of state say, oh, that's what that funny looking shape is on your state highway signs. Our license plates still have it. Remember, our tokens always had it when we used tokens. This is a license plate used before the, I can't remember what that date is, it's the 20s, I think, and that's before the old man was even a state emblem. But we've also got the Old Men Rock t-shirt. I just gave the hat to somebody, a friend of mine from Pennsylvania. I hope he wasn't offended. This postcard and Stoneface Brewing were all manufactured well after the old man fell. So it continues to be an identifier of New Hampshire and something sold to tourists. The Old Men Rock is in all the tourist stores up in the North Country. And Stoneface Brewing is, I can't remember where that is. I think it's around Jackson. But you see the hop is in the shape of the old man. Is it Portsmouth? Okay, thank you. Good. Good to know. And of course, the earliest advertising logo for New Hampshire Fire Insurance featured the old man. And when Jeff was helping me choose some things from the Historic Association collections, all of their stationery had the old man on it. They even had a profile club. So that the employees really identified with the old man of the mountain. They're situated in Manchester, but their logo, their identity was tied to the old man of the mountain. And this was from the 1870s. So this is probably the earliest time that a company was using the old man in their advertising promotional materials. And this is a wonderful, do you still have it on view at the? Yeah, it's really wonderful. It's really large and painted glass, sort of reverse painted glass. It's a beautiful example of 19th century advertising. Even today, politicians are still using the old man in their messaging. The Governor Sununu has used the old man in all of the races that he's been involved with, and even the most recent gubernatorial race, he used the profile in his signage. And last February, well, a year ago February, there was a protest at the White House, at the State House, and Wayne Haubner, who had been a Democratic candidate for New Hampshire Senate and lost, still continued to to be very much involved in trans rights. So he showed up for this protest with a sign that he had designed, using the old man as a significant part of his messaging. So I talked to Mr. Haubner, and I got an email from Governor Sununu's campaign staff, and I asked them, why did you choose the old man in your messaging? And both of them used pretty much identical wording. And both of them talked about the unique spirit of the old man, which connects in their minds as the same idea as the unique spirit of New Hampshire people and that symbol of independence. So in their minds, the old man of the mountain represented this uniqueness and independence of New Hampshire. And it's really interesting to think about that this is a bipartisan symbol, right? You pretty much see that Governor Sununu and Wayne Haubner are on opposite sides probably of a number of issues, but both of them saw the old man as something that identifies their ideas, their ideology, and New Hampshire identity. And then even more recently, if you voted in January, you might have gotten this sticker that was designed by 8-year-old Grace of Milton. So even an 8-year-old who's never seen the old man of the mountain sees that as a great symbol of New Hampshire and celebrating the fact that somebody voted. So it does live on. That symbol does live on. Now, a little bit of history. The old man was discovered by white settlers in 1805. And the story, there are two different stories, but they're remarkably similar, and they have to do with surveying teams that were living up in the Franconia area who had spent the night in the area of Profile Lake, went down to the lake in the morning, looked up, and saw the profile, saw the old man. One of them said, "It's Jefferson himself." And I was thinking about this because how do people living in Franconia, New Hampshire, population not much more than 150, when did they see Thomas Jefferson? Right? So, he doesn't really look like Thomas Jefferson anyway. And over the years, he's been compared to Lincoln and Daniel Webster and all kinds of, and Washington and all kinds of famous people. But the way that people did know what famous people and politicians looked like was through these types of portraits. And these were widely distributed. It was a new technology that had been invented. And so they may have seen something like this, but what I was thinking about is these images were always presented in perfect profile. Right? They never were a forward-facing image. It was always a profile. So unless you were in some very wealthy person, politically connected person's home and saw a painting of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, this is likely what you would have seen, a perfect profile. So it might make sense that when they saw this perfect profile of the old man, they connected it with another profile image they'd seen. Also silhouettes, right, which was sort of an easily reproducible image of a person's physiognomy at the time. There's no photography yet. People aren't, unless you have some money, you're not hiring portrait artists or anything like that. Now, I say white settlers discovered the old man. We don't know the indigenous history of whether the indigenous people who were passing through, there is no archaeological evidence that there were settlements in that area of indigenous people, but we know that there were trails that went through for hunting and trade and things like that. None of them, there's no archaeological evidence that they were near where you could have seen the old man. So more research needs to be done on that. There are tales of Abenaki, Mohawk, tales that seem to relate to a figure in stone who looks down from a mountaintop, but a lot of those had been retold by white 19th century authors. So that's a piece of my research that really needs to be explored much more. But we do know 1805, people saw the profile for the first time. Also, because of the geology up there, it may have appeared a week before. I know most of the rhetoric about it talks about it being 10,000 years ago or something like that, but we don't know. It could have been as recently as 1804 that some rocks fell and it emerged. In the ensuing years, not much was made of the old man. It was noted, people talked about it a little. The more interesting tourist attraction, if you want to call it that brought people to the White Mountains really for the first time for anything but trade, was an incident that happened in Crawford Notch, the Willie Slide. Anybody ever hear of that? When you say, I have the Willies, that's where that comes from. Fun little fact. So the Willie family was living in what's now called Crawford Notch. Huge rainstorms one night in August, huge landslides. And when they went to check on the Willie family the next day, or a few days later after everyone else had dug themselves out, the house was completely intact, untouched. Everything, it looked as though they had gotten up from their dinner and left, which they probably had, run outside. And eventually they found the bodies buried under the landslide that had come down the mountain behind them. The mountain is now called Willie Mountain, and split at a rock right above the house and gone on both sides. And so the family, it was a fairly large family. I think there were maybe five children and a few workmen were killed. This was kind of the first disaster tourism kind of effort or interest. It made international news. And it's the idea of, this is 1826, it's sort of that idea that these were good God-fearing people who took people in as they were passing through and making a life for themselves, and how could this have happened? You know, the idea that, the idea of the sublime, right? Terrible things can happen to good people. And that brought people up to stare at this and to look at it, including Thomas Cole, who was known as the founder of American landscape painting. And his patron tells him to go up there and visit the Willie Slide, and he makes a lot of drawings and sketches and makes a few paintings. The original painting he made from 1827 when he went up, or 1828, is lost, but this was a print that was made from it. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because in that same trip, Thomas Cole goes to visit the Old Man of the Mountain, because someone tells him he needs to visit the Franconia Ironworks, which got a lot more attention than the Old Man, and this peculiar formation of rocks. And it's a little hard to see, but that's his sketch in his notebook, and he wrote about it. And he wrote that it was too dreadful to look upon, and he couldn't stand the silence there, and he hurried away. And he never made a painting of the Old Man. And it's really interesting that he could stand there and sketch and paint the Willie house and the Willie Slide, and one of his best-known paintings is of that. It's in the National Gallery in Washington that he revisited in the early 1840s. But the Old Man was just too awful to look upon. So the Old Man was not this beloved figure right away. In fact, an English author came and wrote about it as well, and she said, so it's a peculiar formation of rocks, and it looks like a man's face. What of it? And so it took a while for this to kind of catch on, which is interesting, because I asked you about the first time you saw the Old Man. If I asked you the first time you saw the Flume or the Basin or some of the other tourist attractions in Franconia Notch, I don't think it would register quite as clearly and memorably as the Old Man experience would. The first published image of the Old Man is rather unusual. In the American Journal of Science and the Arts, which consisted of many more amateur, sort of gentleman scientists, there was a published description of the Old Man of the Mountain that was fairly accurate by a gentleman from Boston. At the same time, this drawing was published to accompany it. And I suspect that the man, or the woman, but I suspect it was a man, since it was the gentleman from Boston, had never actually seen the Old Man. I think it was based on the written description. But this was kind of the first time that the old man was published in anything that was read widely outside of the immediate area. We also, around the same time, see that tourism starts in the northeast part of this country. And routes for carriages and trains are published that take you through Saratoga Springs, Niagara Falls, up to Quebec, and then eventually by the late 1826 and on, down through the White Mountains. You could also go down to the coal mines of Pennsylvania as well. And wealthy people start following these guides in the same way that they might have gone to Europe and done the Grand Tour a few decades before. And Fanny Appleton, who would later marry Longfellow, which is why we have her diaries and her sketches, is taken at the age of 13 on one of these grand tours and sketches a number of really lovely portraits, we call them, of the old man, the Lake of the Old Man, in 1833. So I like to show this because she's a really good example of the earliest tourists who were going up there and taking the time to go and see the old man as a curiosity. And the Northern Traveler would just have a sentence about once you're through visiting the ironworks in Franconia, if you go a little bit south, you'll find this organization of rocks that look like a profile. There was never a whole lot made of it. I wanted to show you the first photograph made of the old man. You see that it's reversed. The earliest photographs were called daguerreotypes, and they were always the reverse image of, basically, if you think about those of us who remember film cameras, and remember when you take the negative, it's always reversed. Well, that's what gets produced with a daguerreotype. It's a singular image. It can't be reproduced. It's done on silvered and other chemicals on copper plates. The exposure time for this was over an hour. And we know that because the photographer Samuel Bemis kept meticulous records. He was a dentist from Boston who spent his summers in Crawford Notch, was one of the first people to buy a daguerreotype kit, a camera, and all the chemicals and copper plates, 80 pounds, and hauls it up to Crawford Notch every summer, and for about 3 summers goes around the North Country and takes photographs. So he took a number of the old man. This is the only one that exists. But 1841 is very early. Photography is invented in 1839 in France. So Bemis may have been the first landscape photographer in the country who was doing something to this extent. But I just want to, I could go on and on about this, but I just wanted to show this to you because it's pretty exciting to think that the old man was one of the first photographs made with this early technology. Other images that allowed the old man to become better known. This is the first geologic survey of New Hampshire, and it's published in 1846. The geologist Charles Jackson brings one of his assistants, is also quite good at sketching, and this was one of the few images in the book. And he talks a little bit about the old man and says that it's, does the measurements and all of that. So pretty accurate measurements. Doesn't say that much more about it. And our first picture book, our first cocktail table or coffee table book. William Oakes hires Isaac Sprague, the illustrator for Audubon, to illustrate the sights of the North Country. And it ends up being just 46 plates. Oakes dies fairly early, or it sort of runs out of steam and then dies. And there are images of the flume and Abel Crawford's house and things like that. The interesting thing is the old man is the only site in this book that is given 2 plates, 2 images, and full page descriptions with it. And what I find interesting about this is one is an image of the old man that's kind of romantic, isn't it? You see the man sitting here, looking up, contemplating the old man. The clouds are kind of surrounding him as though he's just come into view. And I think we're meant to be the person sitting here, enjoying nature, thinking about this figure, whether we see it as a godlike figure or just a beautiful example of nature. And then we have the other page which is much more scientific. Right? We see a attempt to delineate the various ledges of which the old man was composed. And what this is at the bottom was how your eyes view the old man as you're walking towards it and as it comes into view. So he's really giving us what we can expect if we go up there, or allowing the reader to kind of experience what it might be like to see the old man in person. So it's really at about 1850 that the old man starts to become conflated with an identity of New Hampshire. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, I think this Daniel Webster quote starts to be published, discussed. Men hang out their signs indicative of their respective trades. Shoemakers hang out a gigantic shoe, jewelers a monster watch, and a dentist hangs out a gold tooth. But up in the mountains of New Hampshire, God Almighty has hung a sign to show that there he makes men. So here's that connection with the old man and New Hampshire, and also an idea of a New Hampshire personality, right? God has made something that he is so proud of, the New Hampshire man, that he's hanging out a sign to show that here's where my greatest creation is. Right? The interesting thing is we have no record of Daniel Webster ever saying that or writing it. However, it sounds like something he'd say. So it's stuck with all of the histories and everything else. And Daniel Webster was up there a lot. He was friendly with Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was, he was part of promoting the idea of New Hampshire and the New Hampshire spirit and all of that. So we can just let that go and say Daniel Webster said that. So this becomes kind of an aphorism at around the same time that Nathaniel Hawthorne publishes The Great Stone Face. And some of you may remember having to read Nathaniel Hawthorne in school, The House of the Seven Gables and The Scarlet Letter. He wrote short stories too. One of them was The Ambitious Guest, that was based on the Willie tragedy. He too came up to the North Country quite a bit and would write in his diaries and his journals about his experiences. The Great Stone Face was published in 1850 and became very, very popular and was included in short story collections for the decades after his works continued to be published. It tells the story of a young boy named Ernest who lives in the shadow of the Great Stone Face in a little village. And all of his life, Ernest is waiting for a man to come who emulates all the things that Ernest thinks the Great Stone Face is. Someone who looks over everyone, who is rather benign and has the wisdom of the ages, but is very protective, a little bit stoic, doesn't say too much, but is someone who is, an example of the finest of men. And every time a new man comes to the village, Ernest is all excited. A great poet comes and a great politician and a philosopher and all different kinds of men. And every time Ernest is very disappointed that he'll look at this man and he's not acting the way the stone face is supposed to act, and he doesn't look the way the stone face looks. And finally, towards the end of his life, Ernest, who stayed in this village and become a beloved figure, walks into the village during a celebration, and all of the children run up to him, and they point at him and they say, "It is he, it is he, it is the Great Stone Face." And Ernest becomes the man that he wanted to be. Right? He becomes the dream that he was waiting for. Right? Lovely story, very typical of Nathaniel Hawthorne's more romantic stories. But this brought a lot of attention to the idea of the old man, to the idea of the old man being connected with New Hampshire. And by 1850, there are grand hotels that are springing up around the White Mountain area. And people are starting, because of easier transportation, more leisure time, wealthy people are starting to come up and spend the entire summer. And when they spend the entire summer, they're going to all of these sites. And they're buying or reading guidebooks that tell them where to go and when to go and what to see and what to think when you're seeing it. And the old man was a significant part of that. And in fact, huge hotel called the Profile House, right, named for the old man, is situated right, if you've been up to the around Cannon Mountain, here's Echo Lake and Profile Lake, and right in between was the Profile House. Right now it's where the parking lot is for the, roughly where the Cannon tram is. And extended well beyond that, because at its height, it could house 600 guests. And of course, then all of the people it housed who worked there as well. There were stables, there were, eventually there were some outbuildings, so you could rent a cottage all summer. And there were entertainments, anything you wanted. There was food imported, there was oysters and champagne and food imported from France, but there was also lots of food that was grown on the property or on the farm surrounding it. So it was a real luxurious place to stay. And of course, a highlight of that was going to see the Profile, going to see the old man. And the Profile House really capitalized on its proximity to the old man. Even it's, eventually they had a dedicated railway line that went from Bethlehem right to the Profile House, obviously using the old man as their advertising. This is another sort of a view book of the house, using, again, the profile is an important part of that. This was just another one that I kind of like to show that even well into the early 20th century, they were advertising the Profile House. And this book, The White Hills and Their Legends, Landscape, and Poetry by Thomas Starr King, this became the must-have book. It's kind of like, those of you who've traveled, you've probably heard of Rick Steves, and everybody buys a Rick Steves book to figure out where they should go and, you know, what to see. Thomas Starr King was the Rick Steves of his day, but Thomas Starr King was also, he was a Unitarian minister and saw evidence of God's love everywhere. He was very romantic in his writing. He ended up going out to California, so there are mountains named for him in California, and also there's Thomas Starr King Highway here. I think it's part of Route 16. What he says about the old man is that he tells people to go at 4 in the afternoon, and they might encounter some fog and some clouds, and they need to sit and wait patiently. And then eventually the clouds will lift, and they will ring the old man like a giant halo. And it's as though the angels have come, and they're lifting up the veil of the fog. And in the beautiful purple and gold light, it will be as though, you know, this choir of angels is you know, revealing this masterpiece and this mystery to one and all. And the writing and all throughout this is like that. So people love this, and they would have their guidebooks, and they would want to experience what Thomas Starr King told them to experience. So even if you weren't staying at the Profile House, you might be staying at another hotel, but they would have transportation for you to come over and see the old man. So it was very, very sort of the center of North Country tourism at the time. And just to show you the wonderful railroad, that you can still see part of the evidence of the railroad tracks if you're walking around in that area. So another way that the old man becomes synonymous with New Hampshire, or at least that a way that we see that it's sort of a natural progression, is in 1876, David Johnson, who was part of the group of American landscape painters, he worked in the Hudson River Valley like Thomas Cole did, and then also in New Hampshire, is commissioned by the owner of the Profile House to paint this painting of the Old Man of the Mountain. If you want to see this painting, it's in the visitor center at the State House. So you can walk in anytime. It's enormous. We couldn't borrow it for our exhibit. It was just too big and the frame too fragile. But whenever the State House is open, it's really worth going in and taking a look. It's a gorgeous painting. But in 1876, Johnson paints this for Mrs. Taft of the Profile House. And before it goes directly to her, it goes to Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Centennial, to celebrate our nation's centennial, as a representation of our state. So there were always art shows at these big fairs, and this was New Hampshire's submission, and it won a prize. So the idea that the old man of the mountain represented New Hampshire, right? And the jury thought that this was a great example of a New Hampshire painting is clearly indicated here. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes in this painting. Clearly tourism, right, which is an important part of New Hampshire's history, is represented here, number one, because of who commissions it, right, the wife of the owner of the profile house. And you see the people enjoying themselves down at the bottom of Profile Lake. There's a man sitting with his, I think it's his daughter if you look closely, just like that man in the Oaks print, looking up, pointing to the old man. You've got some people in more fancy dress. You've got some people boating on the water, people just taking a walk. And then when you look up at the old man, you kind of see what Thomas Starr King was talking about. It's as though the old man has finally been revealed after perhaps a passing storm. This wonderful light that kind of emanates from behind him to sort of help him glow a little bit. And again, not a good image and too far away. But when you look at this carefully, you see that Johnson is very, very particular and specific about the way that the rocks look, the way the ledges are arranged, the botany that's up there. So he's being very scientific in the way he's painting the old man. He's fudging the perspective a little bit. You couldn't stand where he seems to be standing and see that part of the lake and the old man at the same time. So he's composed from sketches a number of different views, but he makes sure that he's very accurate and specific about the science. And one of the themes that we talked about when we were planning this exhibit were those of tourism, were those of sort of the meaning of the old man, and also the science as well, which I'll talk about that a little bit. So other images of the old man, most hotels had artists in residence, and Edward Hill was an artist in residence of the Profile House for 15 years. This is a work he did fairly large, really probably not intended for the tourist to buy, perhaps, but more particular, and this is, by the way, this is the Profile House, and they're standing at Artist Bluff, if any of you have ever hiked up there. This is Echo Lake, and then looking beyond it to the Profile House. This is more typical of the kinds of paintings, and you might have seen these if you've ever been in little antique shops in New Hampshire. These were produced, they're small, maybe 8 by 10 or 16 by 20, and the artist in residence, Edward Hill in this case, would sit and sketch these, paint them on site, and then people who were there for the summer, of course they had a lot of money, would buy them and bring them home. So there are lots and lots and lots of these, not just by Edward Hill, but by many other artists as well. Another way to see the old man was through a new photographic technology called the stereograph. And this was a way to provide a sense that you are visiting the place by not leaving your armchair. So you would have a three-dimensional view by looking through the stereoscope, and the old man would appear as though you were really looking at him. So by the 1870s, these were produced all over the place, and the most successful stereographic company in the world was in Littleton, New Hampshire. And their most popular images were those of the White Mountains, and in particular, the Old Man of the Mountain. I'm going to skip a little bit because we need to get to the good stuff. Early 20th century, tourism changes. The automobile changes the way people are coming and visiting. They're not staying the entire summer. They might come just for a few hours. They might come just for a night. Another threat to tourism in the White Mountains was the timber companies, all of the smoke and the pollution. One of the ways to counter that was the Weeks Act from 1911, which helped control the pollution of waterways and also establish the White Mountain National Forest. But people were complaining, even in Manchester, apparently people complained on days that timber companies were doing controlled burns that laundry was being soiled from the smoke, and they could smell it in the water and things like that. So imagine going up to the White Mountains and staying in a hotel and having a fire, 20 miles from you, or seeing water being polluted by logs that they were throwing in there. So that was becoming a real problem too. The Profile House, still very successful, but it burns down in 1923 to the ground. The owners claim they're going to rebuild. Then the timber companies come and offer the money, and it was an offer they couldn't refuse. Mm-hmm. The Appalachian Mountain Club, the Society for the Preservation of New Hampshire Forests, and the New Hampshire Federation of Women's Clubs go to the state legislature and the governor, and said, you need to do something about this and we'll help you. The state legislature pledges $200,000 if those organizations can raise another $200,000. And the owners of the 6,000-acre property say that, okay, we'll take the $400,000 if you can raise it, and we won't sell to the timber companies. And at the center of all of this fundraising was the old man. So the New Hampshire Federation of Women's Clubs went for the small money. They reached out all over the country to their fellow clubs. I shouldn't say fellow if it's a women's club, their sister clubs. And those state clubs all pledged a goal. And they went, because it's women's clubs, librarians and school teachers went to their constituents, the kids in their classes and their libraries, and they had cake sales, and they had kids pledging their allowances, and lemonade stands and everything else. And every day there was something in the newspaper about another little boy who was holding a nickel that he was giving to save the old man. It had a wonderful PR campaign. The Appalachian Mountain Club and Forest Society did things like this. This is obviously a doctored photo, but it scared people. And they would send their money. They'd buy a tree as a pledge towards saving Franconia Notch. And they were sort of reaching all levels. Major donations as well. James Storrow of Storrow Drive fame gave, I think, $10,000. Maybe it was $100,000. At any rate, in 1928, Franconia Notch Forest Reservation and Memorial Park was dedicated from that fundraising effort. And you notice it's a memorial park, which we never see on the signs anymore, and I'm not quite sure why. Franconia Notch is saved, the old man as the sort of focal point for saving this, as well as the idea of patriotism as well. World War I had ended when they first started raising money, and it seemed to be a patriotic act as well as saving this icon of New Hampshire. Other threats to the old man. I talked about the ledges, right? And I think most of you know when the old man fell, people were saying, well, it's just been tied up there with, concrete and elastic bands and Elmer's glue or something. And it really, not literally, but there was a forehead ledge that was sliding out. Even as early as the 1870s, the second geological survey, the author of that said, if you want to see the profile, you'd better get up there because that forehead rock is sliding forward and it's not going to be there much longer. Appalachian Mountain Club members were concerned about it. The owners of the Profile House were trying to find someone to fix it. And it wasn't until 1911 that a quarry manager from Quincy, Massachusetts, Edward Geddes, figures out a way to fix it. And he develops these, he called them turnbuckles. But basically what they did was anchor irons, anchor them in from the stone behind to that forehead ledge. And in ensuing years, more people went up there. So the group from Landaff was going up there. This is 1927, where the ownership is still with the Profile House owners, but there's no Profile House. Geddes went up there a few times afterwards, made measurements, said that nothing had changed. And it wasn't until the 1950s, of course the state owns the 6,000 acres by 1928, and they would periodically check on the old man, but it wasn't until 1928, late 1950s, that they start a regular inspection. And in the early 1960s, a man named Niels Nielsen, who's, some of you may remember that name, sort of takes over. He works for the state on the bridge department, for the Department of Transportation. And so he's not afraid of heights, he's not afraid of wind. And he quickly recruits, as his children get older, he's recruiting his children to come up and help too. So there's kind of a mixture of his friends and family and state workers. And at times they're going up and they're adding more of these turnbuckles or anchor irons. He starts going over the side in a bosun's chair, which the photograph is right over there. So you can see how precarious that was. Putting epoxy in various crevices and things like that. And he is named the official caretaker of the old man, and a museum's dedicated to him up at Profile Lake. There's a little cottage there. After Niels dies, his son is named the official caretaker, and the last official inspection is made in spring of 2000. 2002, the year before the old man falls. Now, I'll get to why he fell, but I just want to mention very quickly another threat to the old man, and that's, some of you mentioned how the parkway all of a sudden goes from Route 93, you're speeding along, and all of a sudden you have to go 40 miles an hour, and it's one lane, and if you're up there during foliage season, you're crawling along. There's a reason for that. For 40 years, from the late 1940s, the plans were for the Route 93, the interstate, to go right through Franconia Notch. And people were very concerned that the vibration of cars and even making the road would cause damage to the old man, as well as concerns about the flora and fauna and things like that. Lots of seismic studies were made. Got someone doing that here. I talked to a geologist. He said there was no evidence that blasting or vibration from cars or trucks would have any effect on the old man. Nobody believed it, but he swears it was true. And they kept checking because they were concerned as well. But with the persistence of the Forest Society and Appalachian Mountain Club, there were many other reasons to make that parkway a parkway as opposed to something that people just sped through. So eventually, in 1988, the parkway was finally opened, so 40 years. It's a good civics example. There were federal and state organizations, both from executive, legislative, and judicial, weighing in. And finally, these compromises were made. And I just wanted to show you the gentleman who liked Old Route 3. This was a T-shirt produced in the 1970s with a word bubble coming out of the old man's mouth that says, "Screw 93." So that was, people kept asking us if we could reproduce that. They thought it would be a good fundraiser for the Museum of the White Mountains, for many reasons. But at any rate, it's not just one way, both ways, but there's also, if you notice, there's hardly any shoulder there, and it's really constructed in a very different way than a regular highway, and I think it's only one of two in the whole country. Okay, so the big finale, the old man falls. Sometime the night of May 2nd or early morning May 3rd. And these are just from two different perspectives, and you can see those anchor irons. Some of them actually fell and are on the ground now. The old man was comprised of Conway granite, and we tend to think of granite as something indestructible, lasts forever. But this particular granite is very, I think the word is friable. It's very much affected by weather, and it was, you can see here, what looks like dirt was actually the granite just deteriorating. So even having these anchor irons in there, they were eventually going to give way. They weren't going to stay forever. And all the fears about that forehead ledge being what will cause the old man to fall, that's not what happened. A geologist calls this his autopsy. You could see another kind of drawing up on the banner exhibit over here. The weakest point was under the chin. And if you think about these ledges are cantilevered, and something that's cantilevered, it's always weaker at the bottom. So if you pull the bottom part out, everything else tumbles down because everything was kind of stacked on top of each other. And the geologists knew this. They knew that that was one of the weakest points, but there was nothing they could do about it. In fact, many people in the geology community were surprised that the old man lasted as long as it did. And if you drive up through that area, if you think about all those rocks and things that are lining the parkway, it's called talus. That's basically all the same kind of stuff that the old man was made of. That's constant rock falls up there because of just the nature of the ledges and the rock in that area. So the center of gravity was here. As soon as that fell, everything else fell as well. With, interestingly, they think the forehead ledge going last. So this, I've just made a little reproduction to show you what part of it fell. So I won't read this whole thing to you, but a task force is formed as soon as the old man falls, and Governor Benson vows to rebuild. The task force is made up of scientists, legislators, Dick Hamilton, people who are really interested in the old man, people who are involved in the tourist industry, and what they decide is that they are not going to rebuild it. The geologists are saying we can't rebuild it, it's too dangerous, it won't stay, it's an impossible thing to do. And the more, some of the people who are a little bit more romantic-minded just, agreed that they saw the old man as a symbol more than anything else of its natural beauty and people's independence spirit, and that it will endure if we choose. So they thought memorials around the state made more sense, that the continuing legacy, the enduring legacy, which is what or enduring presence that we called our exhibit, was more important than trying to figure out how to build something, how to recreate it back up on that cliff. But what they did do out of that was form the Old Man of the Mountain Legacy Fund. And they were given permission by the state to create you could call it a memorial plaza. They call it a profile plaza or profiler plaza. And they raised money for a number of things. They thought they'd have a museum there, but that's still in the works. But this plaza, those funny shaped things are called profilers. And what you do is you walk onto the plaza and you find your height. And you stand on the stone where your height is, and you look up, and that profiler recreates the way the old man would look on the side of that cliff. So each profiler, it's not that each profiler has a little old man on it. They're sort of organized in these, when you look at them sort of from the side, they're just all these sort of little bumps that allow your eyes to align the image. It was designed by a toy designer, which makes perfect sense, I think. And I was telling someone earlier, someone told me they had gone up there with multiple generations of their family. And what they thought was wonderful was it was interactive, because you take the time to find your height and stand there and look. And she said, even my 4-year-old grandson was so excited because there was a place for him to stand, which is really lovely. The Legacy Fund right now is planning a museum up there that will kind of recreate what we did at the Museum of the White Mountains and tell the story of the old man and his importance in New Hampshire. So, one of the things I'd like us to think about is, do you think that the old man, in terms of his image as well as his meaning, will continue in New Hampshire? Do you think that he will still have a presence, even though he's been gone 20 years? and maybe in 30 years, when he's gone 50 years, do you think that there will still be that same sense of identity? Anyone have any thoughts about that? Yeah.
I think it's gradually going away in more ways. New Hampshire is the only state left in New England that still has Yankee tradition. And it used to be a red state, not to get into politics, but it's a purple state, right? And, you know, if you look back historically, it just is changing. And so I think that as younger generations come along, maybe the old man didn't have the effect on everybody, but I think it's part of what the state, you know, is gonna lose and is gonna change. We're talking about eliminating town meetings, right? So there's a lot that's changing in the state, and this could be part of the culture, you know, that would leave.
That becomes history as opposed to part of our lives as citizens of New Hampshire.
I still think they should rebuild it.
It would be, drilling into those rocks would be, it would just fall down again. That was the problem. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think one of the issues that we have is the disinterest in schools teaching history. So a lot of, you can go to just the average Joe on the street and ask basic things about history and how it lived. So I think that's what's going to probably have the focus of it disappear.
So the fact that it's not part of the history or an appreciation of history will be gone. Yeah.
You just mentioned it, but you skipped over it quickly just now. Why can't they do something other than, let's say, put the rocks back, but some sort of, let's say, plastic, just to,
Because the weather condition, well, number one, getting people up there. I mean, I guess they could recreate something you could look at, but the weather conditions are so, it's like a whole microclimate up there of ice and wind and rain, and so that nothing would last very long.
I was always thinking that they could do like a profile. I mean, it's weird, but the profile sticking out out of some material, and as you're driving by, you know it's not the old
Right.
man, but hey,
Right.
that's the way it looked.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they considered tons of people sent in proposals, like architects but yeah, I think part of it is if it's too lightweight, it'll just get blown down. If it's too heavy, there's no way to anchor it. I think they were talking about if they did anything, they'd have to go something like 60 yards way back into the bedrock or something like that. They probably could do it, but at what cost? You know. But yeah, and I should say that decision, one person objected, but the rest of the committee was unanimous in agreeing that nothing should be put back up there. But, maybe in 30 years they'll decide they want to recreate it, which wouldn't surprise me. Anyone else have any questions?
Just going back on the timing of the first finding in 1805, very interesting. We were gonna go across, and we did go across the entire United States. Okay, Lewis and Clark, right? Boston was chartered in 1620. Boston is 150 miles away, right? And here we are, 1805. So I just think it's incredible that wasn't seen. But like you said, it's something I never thought of. It could have been formed the year before, right?
Right.
So I just always wondered that because
Right.
Darby went up Mount Washington, I think it was in the 1650
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something like that, so.
And the Crawfords were up. I mean, there were people up there. I always thought that because the lake is right there,
Right.
it's not as though you're in a really obscure place to be able to see the old man. And he may have been seen and no one said anything about it, too, because it doesn't seem to have had the kind of sensation until a little bit later. They mentioned they had seen it, but it wasn't a big deal. until 1640s, they start really publishing things. And
Of course, you were probably worried about a bear getting you or something, so that was probably more on
Yeah.
your mind.
or you're looking at the ground instead of up.
Right.
Well, I'm happy to answer any other questions that anybody has, or any comments, or,
This was wonderful.
oh, thank you. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you get up to see the viewing, the Profiler Plaza, because it's really, really remarkable, the solution they came up with. And
Never knew it existed.
yeah, and hopefully in 2 or 3 years, there'll be another little museum up there too that will be interactive, sort of like this one, with a lot of images to look at, and also it will have an outdoor component so you can walk around and see where the profile house was and things like that. But we're just starting to plan that, so that'll be a few years. Okay, thank you.